Hey guys, it's TheFrXion here, Tag12, having to call me, I don't really care. Welcome back to World of Tanks. We're today taking a look at the T-103, and I have to redo the very first part because it was just way too long. I know that my reviews sometimes do tend to be a bit long, and this one was just way out of line. It was like 25 minutes talking about the vehicle itself before I went into the gameplay, so yeah, let me first reiterate, we're trying to review the T-103, and I do not want to spend like 25 minutes talking about the vehicle before I make a review on it. So how do you get the T-103 and what is it? It is a Tier 8 premium Soviet tank destroyer that you can currently get in the pawn shop. It's a very, very well-liked tank, a tank that I first did not enjoy because I thought that was kind of stupid, because it was big and bulky, but then when I first got my hands on it to play it myself, it was a lot of fun, and it still is. And I think it's one of the best choices going this far already out at the beginning of the review, out of the bond shop, because it's the only Tier 8 premium tank destroyer that they have. In fact, it's the only tank destroyer they have in this entire setup, except for the M10 RBFM. And it's a very powerful one. There are other vehicles in here that are okay. Like the Chrysler GF is great. It's a lot of fun. It's quite powerful. But then there are also some tanks that are not as good. For example, where is it? The M46 Patton Korea is certainly not a very good choice. But let's talk about what makes the T-103 so special. Now, let me go into the gun characteristics real fast. It's a 130 millimeter B13 gun. It does 440 alpha damage, 258 millimeters of penetration with the standard shells, to 307 millimeters of penetration with the premium shells, which are also AP shells, but they have more pen. They all have 870 meters shell velocity. So it's not the fastest shell to travel for both the AP, the premium AP, and the high explosive. It takes a while for the shells to reach the target. One of the cool things though that you have with this tank is the rate of fire is very high. If I take the crew off and all the equipment, the rate of fire on this tank would be something along the lines of 5.6, I think, if I recall correctly. And it should be something along there. So it's about 10 seconds reload time for a single round with 440 damage. That's very good. So that means you have very high DPM. DPM without the gun rammer, without Brothers in Arms, is about 2,500. That is really good for a Tier 8 premium tank, but you are lacking the gun traverse on this vehicle. What you can see currently is I'm using the equipment with the improved rotation mechanism, which gives me better gun traverse speed. And you really need that 18 degrees per second gun traverse with that equipment and with the training. That's the only thing you can get. That's really, really bad. You need better gun traverse because this tank lives off fighting in close quarter combat, but it also can be very useful and very strong in longer distance engagements. That is mainly because it has 8 degrees of gun depression, 30 degrees of gun elevation, which is great, and you have very, very good gun handling capabilities. 2.26 seconds aim time, that's not too bad. 0.33 dispersion, it's 0.36 without any of the crew and any equipment, but that's already very good for a Soviet tank destroyer. 0.33, you're quite accurate. Even at longer distances, this tank does prove to hit its target with a lot of reliability. Moving on to the survivability, this is where the tank really shines. This is where the T-103 really kind of outshines the SU-130 PM, the Scorpion G, and it becomes one of the very, very fun tanks to play that you don't really find on the Soviet tech tree, because you either have tank destroyers that are very lightly armored but hit very hard, or you have tank destroyers that are very heavily armored that hit okay, that hit like not as hard as the lightly armored ones, but none of them have a turret. The only turreted tank destroyers in the tech tree are premium ones, the SE-130PM and the T-103, and both of them are actually no longer available in the tech tree, so you can only buy them either from the bond shop with this one, or you can only buy the SE-130PM with cash when it comes around every once in a while. So you don't have a lot of hit points. That's one of the biggest issues when you're playing a tank destroyer. You only have 1,250. I have the equipment with improved hardening on this tank because I want more HP, because it's one of the field modifications that you can upgrade. But we're going to talk about that in the later section, where I've already produced the part of the video, and I'm just going to be adding that one in there. So hopefully everything is going to align very nicely. You have really good turret armor of 220 millimeters at the front, 145 on the side, and 60 at the rear, with a couple of weak spots. That's very important because this tank has also decent hull armor, 100 millimeters at the front, 100 on the side, and 60 on the rear. And with the angling that you have right here, the upper hull is actually going to be able to deflect quite a few rounds. With the angling that you have right here, you can deflect a couple of rounds up there. The turret is very strong at the front. Somehow a lot of players kind of bounce off the turret because they are expecting a Soviet tank destroyer of this stature to not be very well armored, but they are very wrong because this tank is very well armored. It's more on the side of a heavy tank than a tank destroyer, to be fair, except for the hit points, and that's basically it. The mobility is very good. We're going to talk about that in a second as well. So how do you take care of the T-103 when you're opposing one of these big giants? Well, you have the cupola on top, which is a clear and obvious weak spot. You have the two cupolas down here, and you have this massive turret ring housing. The turret ring is right here, but this entire housing, which kind of is the crew compartment below, is very easy to penetrate. It's very thin. It's part of the hull armor, so it's probably no thicker than 100 millimeters. So if you are trying to shoot this tank, shoot it below the turret ring. Like, shoot it below the turret right here. This is a great area to hit it. You can hit the cupolas down here as well. They're not as strong, and you can take care of this vehicle quite easily if you know the weak spots. It does fight back, and if it is able to shoot you, it's going to hurt a lot, because 258 millimeters of penetration is going to be something that you do not want to be at the end of, because you will probably not have enough armor to withstand a blast, and at the same time the rate of fire is quite high, so he might get 1 or 2 shots into you before you can even do a massive amounts of damage to him. Now on the other hand, you have 66 tons. I currently have the improved hardening, so you have a bigger weight load limit, and the engine power is 900 horsepower on this vehicle. So yeah, your specific power to weight ratio is not the best, 14.15, but you have decent top speed, 40 kilometers per hour top speed, and it actually does allow you to travel around in 35 kilometers per hour top speed, and I think it feels quite quick for the size it has. For a tank of this stature, this vehicle certainly feels like a very mobile vehicle. It does have the traverse speed if you use the right equipment, but we're going to talk about that later as well. But you can see the base traverse speed is 29 degrees per second. Now with the right traverse speed, with the right equipment, with the training, you can get it to 37.29. You can increase it even more with premium consumables, but 37.29 is about on the same length as the SE-130PM, and I think you're going to be doing just fine with that. It's going to allow you to turn your tank towards the enemy that is facing you, and it's still going to be something that is very important because your traverse speed on the gun is not very good. Now coming to one of the biggest issues of the tank, and it certainly is its concealment. This vehicle does not have very good concealment. It is very, very big, very difficult to conceal because it's such a large tank. Now, look at the SE-130PM in comparison. It is tiny. It's so small. Now, let's take a look at the KV-4 Kraslavsky. It's a big, massive, very hulky tank. And then we have the T-103. It's even bigger than the KV-4 Kraslavsky, so it's a very easy target. It's a big target. If you get outflanked, you're going to be in a very, very painful situation. So concealment, that is something you can train to if you have the two slots, the two equipment slots, and I'm going to talk about that in the next part of the video. Then Spotting, 413 meters base view range with the skills, not the greatest, but I still think that the concealment factor here is more important, and I'm much rather push the concealment than the spotting, because in the end, trying to get this tank more concealed is probably going to be a better thing, because if you're firing from behind the lines, you probably have someone spotting for you, so it's not that important. You're a tank destroyer after all, and your main objective is to do damage and not to spot the enemy team. So having talked about this, I think we've set up a picture where the tank kind of feels like it is a very good vehicle in close quarter situations, but at the same time, it also has the capabilities of being a second line or third line tank that is able to provide support with its fire. And at the same time, because you don't really have to use premium shells, because you already have 258 millimeters of penetration, this is probably going to be a tank that is going to not cost you a lot of credits to play, because it's quite cheap. So let's move on to the other part. Let's take a look at the equipment. Then we're going to go to the gameplay and have a final verdict. And hopefully we can round off this review in a nice fashion. And I'll see you guys in a second. Okay, so I had to cut it because the part where I was talking about the equipment was just way too long and I went way overboard. So I'm just going to put it like this. The equipment on this tank really depends on what you want to do with it. You have the opportunity to run with two setups. Now, usually I'm too poor to run two setups on one tank, but if you're smart, you basically run one setup that really works out for you in general, and if it's a tank that you really, really like, you can just add a second setup. Tank that you always play. So I have too many premium tanks to have two setups for every single one of them. I wouldn't be getting done with anything in my life because I'm just constantly grinding. But now with having like the let's just talk about it as a hypothetical. This is your only premium tank and you want to set it up for the right kind of situation. So what you want to do is you want to have one setup for an offensive play when you're in a city. The very cool thing about this vehicle is that you have the armor that other tank destroyers do not have, or that other tank destroyers have, but then they lack mobility and other things. This tank has very nice mobility and it has very nice armor. That armor is something that you should be using. So how do you use that in a close quarter combat environment where you are fighting other tanks that are maybe 100, 200 meters away from you, and you need to aim for the weak spots? You need to be able to do some damage and you want to protect yourself at the same time. What kind of equipment would really help you out? Well, there are several things that you can do. Let's take a look at the field modifications before we go to the equipment, because it's quite important right here. Because the last one, the second slot category, is going to be the one that is very important, because that's the one you cannot change every single time, even with the equipment slot that you can choose, but this one is basically going to be tied down to a very specific item which will give you a boost. So in the end, you still have to choose between one of them, and you just have to look how you're going to be playing this tank by yourself. So what I would certainly do for the firepower tab, if you're in a close quarter combat zone, there's always the gun rammer that you can put on. If you don't think of anything else, you can't think of anything else, the gun rammer is going to work wonders for you. The aim time is decent enough. You don't really need an aiming device. The dispersion is good enough, especially for a Soviet tank. It's really nice. You don't really need an enhanced gun laying drive. You can see I have 11 of them lying around right now. So the gun rammer would be a natural choice in that kind of scenario. Get the gun loading time down to 9.29 seconds for a single shot. That's very good for 440 damage. That is 2,841 DPM. Extremely good. But what you can also do is you can get the improved rotation mechanism on this slot and get your gun traverse up there and your traverse speed. You can see without it, the traverse speed is at 33.14. That's because of the skills that I have. This is going to be very nice already, but with this, you're going to have a lot better mobility. You're going to be able to turn your tank around quickly. You're going to be able to turn your turret around faster, and add that together, you can always turn your tank and turret into the direction you need to shoot at. So that's something that you can do. That's what I've been basically playing as. Then obviously the next one, because I've chosen the improved survivability tab, I wanted to get more HP on this tank. If I'm playing in a city and I want to be able to withstand more shots, I just thought that why not use the improved hardening thing. If you really don't care about the additional 130 HP, which you think that might not be saving you, you could also use the improved ventilation to still get the bonus on here, and that might just be something that gives you a better boost on everything. DPM might give you a better boost on traverse speed even more, on concealment and on spotting as well. So that's something that is also not a bad choice. But I think I'd probably go for improved hardening, give you that additional 130 HP just to give you a bit more survivability chance, and also better suspension durability, repair speed, and less hull damage by impact if somebody really is trying to ram you or something like that. So I think that is a very good choice. Then the final one is really like in a city, when you're fighting in a city, certainly I think gun rammer, why not use the gun rammer, right? So you can choose if you want to put the gun rammer in the improved slot, or if you want to put the improved rotation mechanism. I think I would rather have the improved rotation mechanism because the DPM is already that good, and I don't really need the gun rammer in that slot because yeah, DPM is great, the gun traverse is not that great. So that would be my very first option, my very first choice when I'm be playing this tank in a city environment. What about the second one? When you're playing this tank more as a sniping tank destroyer, sitting at the second, third line, and you're just shooting at targets far, far away from you. Well, basically in that situation, as always, as we mentioned prior, the first equipment slot this time around, I would probably pick the gun rammer just to get more DPM in there when you're trying to shoot tanks that are far away, to do as much damage as you can in this in the time that you have to. Then one thing that you really need to address with this tank is the concealment. The concealment on this vehicle is not very good. It's quite horrific, to be fair. So in this turn, it would actually be very, very advantageous for you if you have the scouting speciality picked out. With the scouting speciality, what you can do is you can get the low noise exhaust or the camouflage net into this section, and then get the low noise exhaust into the next one, and you might just be able to get 200 additional points and increase the stationary spotting just a bit more, or not concealment, just a bit more, to get it into an area where you might just be able to hide the tank. But it's very difficult to hide this tank. It's a very large tank, very difficult to hide because of its size. So it really is one of its main downsides. But you can negate it by using the right equipment, like right here. Then you can also use the directive slots, which will give you, well, it depends what kind of equipment you have on here, but somehow like the exhaust insulation right there, you add that on top of it, you have 2% additional, and then you can also go down here to get extra combat rations. You're gonna get concealment up by just a little bit more, but it's very difficult. It's really, really difficult to hide this tank. So yeah, that's just something you have to live with. The one thing that you have instead of the other vehicles, what the other tanks just don't have, like the SC-130PM, is the SC-130PM doesn't have any armor. It's a very small tank, that's why it's very easy to conceal, but it doesn't have any armor. The SC-130PM at least has armor if it does get lit up. So yeah, that is the best kind of tips I could give you for this vehicle, because it's very difficult to stay hidden when you're playing the T-103, except if you're really using double bushes, if you're using all the right equipment. You can push it to an area where it is okay, but it's not going to be great. So I hope I've talked about the most important parts, and we're gonna move on to the gameplay, and hopefully I can show you why this tank is such a cool vehicle, and why it's a very enjoyable experience even for a player who is not mainly a tank destroyer driver, such as me. Okay, so the gameplay I've chosen for you guys is one where you're very active in this tank. I think I was thinking about getting 2 gameplays, but I think that it's just too long. The video would be too long. I think with this gameplay, I can show you the main points of the vehicle, and you can see the strengths and the weaknesses of the vehicle quite nicely. Now, what you can see immediately is that the T-103 is massive. It's way bigger than the T-34, and the T-34 is already very, very tall. You have 8 degrees of gun depression, which is quite nice, and it allows you to do some things that some TDs are not able to do. Right there, we hit the Progetto 46 very hard once in his side armor, and he bounces right twice of our vehicle, once off the upper plate and once off the turret. That's just something that you can do when you're playing the T-103, because when you're peeking somewhere, this tank has such a big forehead that people just kind of start shooting the forehead instead of aiming somewhere, because they're not really expecting a tank destroyer to be this well armored. And it's almost impossible to stay hidden and to stay unspotted when you're playing this tank. What you can see right here is we're just kind of waiting for someone to make a mistake and move into a position where we can shoot him. And right there we find a target, a T-100, 122 TM, and we do manage to spot him and we manage to track him. Unfortunately, we take a hit, and you can see immediately we've lost about 1/3 of our HP. 386 damage. He probably penetrated our he actually penetrated the upper plate of our hull armor. That's just something you have to keep in mind when you're playing this tank. Now, the gun itself, very competitive. Sometimes it lets you down a little bit. Right there, unfortunately, we do not hit the Progetto 46. With vertical stabilizers, we probably would have been able to put one into him, but since this tank doesn't have vertical stabilizers, we weren't able to do anything of that sort. You can see that we're trying to hide our lower plate, and at the same time, we're just trying to present our massive forehead to the enemy that are trying to, shoot at us, and they're trying to take care of us, but they're failing quite miserably, because obviously if you do not aim at this tank correctly, you're just not going to be able to do any damage. So far, the game hasn't been going on for a very long time. We've already dealt 1,799 damage very, very quickly, very rapidly, because the rate of fire on this tank is just that damn great. The gun handling is also very nice. You can see the ELC once more doesn't pen us, and we are going to punish him for 466 with a single shot. You can see that's a very disastrous hit for a tank like the ELC even 90. What are you supposed to do in a tank that is so small and only has 900 HP? You get hit for 466, you've already lost more than half of your HP. So right here we're trying to put some pressure on these guys, but we do also spot the Scorpion G, and you can see that when you hit the Scorpion G like that, it's going to do a lot of damage. But you're going to be melting very quickly if you're not careful. That is one of the biggest issues. You only have 1,250 HP, and that 1,250 HP is not going to be carrying you for a very long time, especially when you're playing against tier 9 and tier 10 tanks. Against those tier 9s and 10s, it's going to be a very different story. Also, the high explosive shell. That was a hit on the side of the armor, but we didn't manage to penetrate him. So that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind as well. But one of the cool things about the tank is just, having the 258 millimeters of penetration as standard. You really don't need to spend any credits on premium shells. I haven't fired a single shot of premium in the last 15 games that I've played this tank recently, and you can see every single one of those hits has been quite devastating for the enemy. So yeah, the game unfortunately is going to be ending very quickly, but I think you could see that this tank is very, very powerful if left to its own devices where no one is really contesting you. You can really do a lot of damage because the DPM is great. The gun handling is great in itself. The armor is really spectacular for a tank destroyer, and even at longer distances you're still quite reliably taking care of these tanks, doing that massive alpha damage right there, 452. And I think this is one of the main features that people like. Why this tank is so well liked, because with the right equipment, even the rotation speed that we have, it gets better. And okay, so let's talk about the final verdict on this tank, because the T-103 is certainly a vehicle that possesses a lot of power. It's a very powerful tier 8 premium tank destroyer. And I think it's one of the best bond vehicles that you can get, certainly in the bond shop right now. As a tank destroyer player, I'm not a very good tank destroyer player. I'm too aggressive. I usually lose too much HP. But I love the fact that you can do that amount of damage in a TD. That's something that you mostly cannot do in a medium tank. It's very difficult to get like these high damage games in a medium tank, because even if you fire so many rounds, you almost never get to that damage tally, because you most of the time do not have the alpha to get like crazy amounts of damage. But with a tank destroyer like a T-103, this was not my only game where I had like 3004k damage, because it just fires this quickly. It has such a high rate of fire. The armor works quite nicely, especially in tier 8 matches and tier 9 matches even it does work as well. And the tank itself is not immobile, you know? For the size of it, for the sheer length and height that we have with this vehicle, it is capable of fighting very, very aggressively in parts that you would not expect from a tank destroyer. You can see, compared to Scorpion G, it's a huge vehicle. It's almost as big as the house that we're trying to hide behind. But it gives you the flexibility to be very competitive in close quarter engagements, and at the same time you can always still stay behind somewhere in the back and use it as a sniping vehicle. That's something that you cannot do with Scorpion G. You know, even though you're faster with Scorpion G, you have other strengths. The T-103 just has like a very nice amount of flexibility that allows it also to be a close quarter fighter. Even though it still lacks the HP to have longer fights and to fight against several opponents, as a supportive vehicle with other heavy tanks, this can be a very good asset in close quarter combat. So if you're a heavy tank player that maybe wants to play a tank destroyer every once in a while, and you know, you don't want to spend any kind of credits, this is a very good choice. Everyone who doesn't want to waste any credits can just play this tank, because it does create a lot of credits without wasting too many credits, because you almost never have to fire premium shells with this thing. 258 damage is just really great against all of the vehicles at tier 8, tier 9, and even tier 10. So that makes you very flexible, and that makes it a very cheap kind of tank to play. And I think coupled together with all of those things that we've mentioned prior, the right equipment, and if you want to play this tank for a bit longer, I think this is a very good choice, even for players that do not specialize on tank destroyers. This could be a great entryway for people who want to play those big guns, who want to have that alpha, but they do not want to sacrifice all of the, all of the protection that they have come to enjoy with the heavy tanks. And this is why I think this is a really, generally speaking, a great tank and very enjoyable for a lot of players. One of the biggest downsides on this vehicle is its size. It's very big and it's very difficult to hide. Another downside that you have with this tank is nothing to do with the vehicle itself, but with the fact that no other Soviet tanks, at least no other Soviet tank destroyers, kind of come close to the gameplay of this vehicle, at least in the sense of having armor and a turret. There are tanks in the Soviet tech tree, TDs, that have a lot of armor, like the entire line for the Object 268 version 4, but they do not have a turret. Having a turret gives you so much more flexibility, and that's just something that you usually only find on American tank destroyers or other tank destroyers like the German ones, which do not have armor. So if you're an American tank destroyer fan, this is something that might just be for you. This could be the entryway to your Soviet TDs. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this commentary and review. As always, comment, like, and subscribe, and I see you on the next video. Until then, have a good one.